Lebensborn, the spring of life, a place where women were paired with Schutzstaffel officers to produce perfect Aryan babies. These babies were raised in an environment so perfect that they were called super babies. Was it love for the babies? It wasn't love or family. It was a factory for human breeding. Blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin. Doesn't that sound like a character straight out of a fantasy? Well, for Nazi Germany, this wasn't just a fantasy. It was their obsession. The pure Aryan race was their twisted ideal. But how far would they go to create this so-called perfect race? The answer? Far enough to set up secret breeding farms. What really happened inside those walls? Who were the women? What happened to the children? Let's dig into this unsettling chapter of history and uncover the truth. Welcome to Historical Digs, where we dig out the secrets from the annals of history. Nazi Germany, 1935. A sinister idea was born in the dark corridors of power. A project with a deceptively gentle name. Lebensborn, or the Fount of Life. At first glance, it seemed noble, offering welfare to mothers, caring for children, and supporting families. But beneath this seemingly harmless facade lay something far more sinister. This wasn't just about helping mothers and babies, no. This was about creating a master race. And it was Heinrich Himmler, one of the most feared figures of the Nazi regime, who orchestrated it all. The first Lebensborn home opened in Steinhüring, a small village near Munich. It was meant to be a welfare institution at first, helping the wives of Schutzstaffel officers with family matters and pregnancy care. Now, racially valuable wasn't just some vague idea. It meant you had to prove your Aryan bloodline. The Lebensborn program, established on the 12th of December 1935, wasn't just a welfare initiative, but a calculated strategy to engineer human lives. Himmler's obsession with racial purity and eugenics drove its creation. It became an arm of the Schutzstaffel, the most notorious organization of the Nazi regime, blending social welfare with terrifying racial policies. Every step, every decision was rooted in the belief that only the pure Aryans deserved to exist and thrive. Lebensborn wasn't just about encouraging childbirth. It was about controlling it. Unmarried women who met strict racial purity standards were lured into secretive maternity homes. These weren't cozy nurseries. They were breeding grounds where women were encouraged, sometimes pressured, to have children with Schutzstaffel officers. Love? Consent? That didn't matter. What mattered was the bloodline. And then came the children. Babies born in these homes were carefully examined. Were they racially pure? Did they fit the Nazi ideal? If so, they were celebrated, cared for, and often given to high-ranking Nazi families to be raised in a regime's image. But if they didn't meet the criteria, that's a question nobody wanted to ask, because the answers are too horrifying to imagine. The program wasn't just about birth. It was about the shaping of the future of Nazi Germany. You see, Lebensborn wasn't just for women of the Schutzstaffel. They reached out to single mothers and women in occupied countries like Norway, Poland, and even further into Eastern Europe. The Nazi regime was so determined to increase their racially superior population that they had no reservations about kidnapping children they deemed to be Aryan. Doctors would inspect every woman to ensure she had good blood. They were even screening the fathers to ensure that these babies would be born into the right families. The women were given financial aid and adoption services and were encouraged to give birth in private, away from any kind of societal shame. The Nazis were all about making sure no one would shame a racially valuable single mother. Lebensborn didn't stop at creating Aryan babies in Germany. As the Nazis expanded across Europe, they began kidnapping children from occupied countries. Children with the right features: blonde hair, blue eyes. Innocent children were ripped from their families and given new German names, new German parents, and a new identity. Thousands of these stolen children were absorbed into the Nazi machine. On September 13, 1936, Himmler made his vision crystal clear in a directive to Schutzstaffel members. Lebensborn wasn't optional. It was an honorable duty. The program's leaders like Max Solman and Dr. Gregor Ebner operated under Himmler's direct supervision, making sure everything went according to plan. By 1939, the program had 8,000 members, including 3,500 high-ranking Schutzstaffel officers. However, this wasn't just about growing numbers. It was about eliminating everyone who didn't fit their vision of perfection. Every step of the Lebensborn program was a calculated move to erase diversity and enforce the Nazis' nightmarish ideals. But what happened to the thousands of children who were born or stolen under this program? Where did they go? What became of their lives after the war? Lebensborn didn't just stop taking care of women. In the year 1939, they started making moves across occupied territories. In Norway, for example, the Nazis opened several homes, aiming to help women who were having children with German soldiers. These mothers often didn't know the full scope of what was going on. In some cases, they gave their children up for adoption without realizing that their babies were going to be taken to Germany, never to see them again. The Nazis weren't just helping with pregnancies, they were trying to make sure the right kids were being born. The idea was simple: increase the Aryan race by taking kids from occupied territories and sending them back to Germany, where they'd be raised as the perfect future for the Reich. But it wasn't just about stealing babies. Lebensborn homes were set up to handle pregnancies and births. They were making sure that only the best children would be born, children who could later grow up to be a part of the Schutzstaffel or future Nazi officers. Everything about Lebensborn was focused on producing future soldiers for the regime. These were breeding farms disguised as maternity homes. What about the men in all this? The Schutzstaffel men were the supposed elite. Himmler pushed them to marry early and have lots of kids, at least 4 if not more. The idea? Strengthen the Nazi regime by creating the perfect racial elite. The Schutzstaffel men had to prove they were racially pure before they could marry, and only then could they start producing those perfect babies. Lebensborn wasn't just about helping women. It was about manipulating the future, all wrapped up in this twisted eugenics agenda. What followed was a twisted system of racial tests, where children were classified into 3 categories: desirable, acceptable, and worst of all, unwanted. The desirable children were those who had the right physical traits, the ideal Aryan features. These kids were sent to German families where they could be raised as if they were true Germans, even though they had no connection to the country. Those who were deemed unwanted were either sent to concentration camps to die or forced into labor. The acceptable ones were sent to German boarding schools where their old identities were erased. New German names, a new language, and forced loyalty to the Reich were all part of the program. And if any child dared to resist this forced Germanization, they were punished. Himmler was hoping that through this program, he would create a future generation of a strong, racially pure Germans to dominate Europe. He had dreams of this program being the backbone of a master race, but it didn't go quite as planned. What went wrong though? The Lebensborn homes, despite all their secrecy and their grand vision, weren't as effective as Himmler had hoped. There were complaints about the quality of healthcare in the homes, and the program's strict secrecy meant that it could advertise to attract eligible women. So, fewer and fewer women were signing up, and it became harder and harder to get the right people into the homes. The numbers didn't add up. Himmler had estimated that 100,000 racially valuable German women were secretly getting abortions each year. But despite increasing penalties and pressure to have children, the Lebensborn program only managed to produce about 7,000 babies in its entire 9-year history. To make matters worse, the program was getting a reputation for being a bit exclusive, if not downright selective. They didn't just let anyone in. Applicants had to pass rigorous checks to ensure they were racially pure. This was about more than just family history or health. It was about creating a perfect specimen of what the Nazis deemed the ideal human. You had to have the right family background and the right medical history, and above all, you had to pass their strict racial purity tests. Anyone who didn't meet these standards were simply turned away. And yet, despite all these setbacks, the Lebensborn program carried on, with Himmler still holding on to the dream of creating a new generation of super Germans. The truth, however, was that the program was already showing cracks. Not only were they struggling to find enough willing participants, but the very ideals that they were trying to promote were becoming increasingly irrelevant in the face of reality. People were waking up to the horrors of war, and the idea of using women as mere tools for breeding the perfect race was starting to lose its appeal. After the war ended, the Lebensborn program was left in tatters, with its secrets slowly being dragged into the light. In the aftermath of Germany's surrender, the Allies were quick to investigate the program, especially the horrifying idea that children had been stolen from their homes and forcibly moved to Germany. One of the biggest mysteries surrounding the program was what happened to the foreign-born children. After the war, around 10,000 children, many of them taken from places like Poland, Russia, and other Eastern European countries, were found in the American-controlled part of Germany. These children were referred to as super babies, a twisted nod to the Nazi belief in creating a new generation of Aryans. These children had been well-fed, kept in the best health, and, to some, looked like little angels compared to the starving, struggling people around them. They were given 2 baths a day, kept in the sun to ensure they stayed healthy, and everything they touched, blankets, clothes, even the food they ate, was disinfected. The nurses would ensure the babies ate everything on their plates, believing it was a way to create perfect, strong Aryans. In the trial of the Lebensborn leaders, the case took a twist that many didn't expect. While the court did acknowledge that a child kidnapping program had been operating in parts of northeastern Europe, the verdict wasn't as clear-cut as many hoped. The court found that about 340 children in the American-controlled zone of Germany were linked directly to the Lebensborn program. However, they couldn't pin the blame on the accused as they were ultimately acquitted of the charges of kidnapping. But that didn't mean the story was over. It turns out that some of the abductions had been carried out by people who weren't members of Lebensborn at all, complicating the case further. Who exactly was responsible for the widespread removal of children? It became a game of blame shifting, with various factions trying to dodge responsibility. But the real issue lay in the fact that much of the evidence was conveniently destroyed by Schutzstaffel members before they fled from the advancing Allied forces. Entire archives vanished. As the world tried to come to terms with the atrocities of war, the Lebensborn children who survived began to face their battles. Many of them had been taken from their birth families and placed in German households, often with little understanding of their true origins. These children were told they had been orphaned by the war. The women who had been involved with the program were often excluded. Many of them were treated as pariahs, blamed for the horrors of the Nazi regime, even though they were victims in their own right. After the war, locals would take out their anger on the women, cutting their hair off, beating them, and running them out of the community. These were women who had given birth in the Lebensborn homes, often to children who were the product of relationships with Schutzstaffel soldiers. In a time of post-war bitterness and revenge, they became easy targets. As the years passed, the myths surrounding the Lebensborn program began to spread. Some of the stories that circulated were far from the truth, fueled by post-war propaganda and the desire to understand just how far the Nazi regime had gone. One of the most persistent misconceptions was that the Lebensborn program had been a coercive breeding experiment, forcing women to have children for the master race. However, the truth wasn't so simple. While the program certainly encouraged relationships between German soldiers and women in occupied countries, especially Nordic women, it wasn't as straightforward as forced breeding. Reports started emerging in the 1950s, especially from the German magazine Review, which sensationalized the program. They painted the picture of a massive, coercive breeding campaign. There were certainly cases where women were pressured or manipulated, but many of the relationships were, in fact, consensual, at least in the eyes of the people involved. The Schutzstaffel men who fathered children in the Lebensborn homes did so with a purpose: to create a new generation of Aryans. The real horror of the Lebensborn program wasn't just about creating a race of super babies. It was about the lives that were destroyed along the way, the families torn apart, the children kidnapped, and the women left to carry the shame of something they never fully understood. But what do you think? Were their actions truly justified? Let us know in the comment section below. And make sure to subscribe to the channel and come back for more history digs. Thanks for watching.